Let's talk about what survival really looked like for enslaved people on southern plantations. The food they ate wasn't about flavor, luxury, or even basic comfort. It was about staying alive with whatever they could get their hands on. Their daily meals weren't carefully prepared feasts, but a mix of scraps, foraged plants, small game, and makeshift recipes that turned the absolute bare minimum into sustenance. Most of the time, enslaved people weren't given proper meals. They were handed the toughest cuts of meat, stale cornmeal, and the vegetables plantation owners didn't want. If they wanted anything beyond that, they had to find it themselves, hunting, fishing, trapping, and foraging for wild plants, just to add some variety to their diets. But despite these harsh conditions, they made the most out of the worst, turning scraps into nourishment and creating dishes that would eventually shape Southern cuisine. So let's take a flashback into some foods that enslaved people ate on plantations. Meals that kept them alive, sustained their families, and proved that even in the darkest times, resourcefulness and strength could turn the simplest ingredients into something meaningful. Cornbread. Cornbread wasn't just a side dish for enslaved people, it was a survival staple. Corn was one of the few ingredients plantation owners provided regularly, and enslaved people had to get creative with how they used it. Unlike wheat flour, which was often reserved for the wealthy, cornmeal was cheap, filling, and easy to store, making it the perfect base for a simple yet essential food. Cornbread came in many forms. Some people made it thick and crumbly, baking it over hot coals or in a skillet if they had access to one. Others turned it into hoe cakes, a flatter version cooked on a metal hoe over an open fire. If no skillet or metal tool was available, cornbread could even be made by wrapping the batter in leaves and baking it in the embers of a fire. Since cornmeal alone wasn't very flavorful, enslaved cooks added whatever they could find. Some mixed in wild honey for sweetness, salt if they had any, or even mashed vegetables like sweet potatoes to stretch their limited resources. Cornbread wasn't just food, it was fuel. It provided much-needed energy for long hours of grueling labor. It was also portable, meaning it could be taken into the fields and eaten throughout the day. Over time, cornbread became a lasting tradition, passed down through generations. Today, it remains a staple of Southern cuisine, a reminder of the resilience and ingenuity of those who had so little yet made so much. Speaking of cornbread's close relatives, hoe cakes were basically its rougher, grittier cousin. A little thinner, crispier, and made straight from the field, they were the ultimate survival pancake. Hoe cakes. If cornbread was the go-to, then hoe cakes were the backup plan. These were flat, crispy cornmeal cakes that got their name because, get this, they were often cooked on the blade of a hoe over an open fire. Yeah, real survival mode. The recipe was as simple as it gets. Mix cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, stir it into a thin batter, and cook it right on a hot surface. Sometimes, if there was access to fat or lard, people would fry them up for a little extra crisp and flavor. But even without it, they were quick, easy, and could be eaten on the go. Hoe cakes were especially useful for field workers who needed something fast, portable, and filling. Since they were thin and crispy, they could be stacked, wrapped, and taken out into the fields to be eaten in between labor. No forks, no plates, just hand-to-mouth fuel. Despite their humble beginnings, hoe cakes still live on in Southern cooking today. Add a little butter and honey, and you've got a comfort food classic. Now, if you thought hoe cakes were simple, wait until you hear about our next dish. These were even more basic, cooked straight in the ashes of a fire, because when food was scarce, you had to make do with what you had. Ash cakes. If you think cooking without a pan sounds wild, let me introduce you to ash cakes. These were literal survival bread, made with cornmeal and water, and then buried directly in hot ashes to cook. Yep, no skillet, no oven, just straight fire pit ingenuity. Why cook this way? Because sometimes there was no other choice. Fire was readily available, but pots and pans? Not so much. Enslaved people, especially those working in remote areas, had to get creative. The hot ashes acted as a natural oven, cooking the cakes slowly and evenly while sealing in moisture. The result? A crispy, charred exterior with a soft, warm inside. Ash cakes weren't fancy, but they were functional. They filled empty stomachs and kept people going through long hours of work. Some people would brush off the ashes and eat them plain, while others dipped them in molasses if they were lucky enough to have some. This method of cooking wasn't just about survival, it was about resilience. It It showed how enslaved people made the most of limited resources and turned necessity into nourishment. And if you thought cornmeal-based foods were the only staple, think again. Fatback was another key survival food, because when meat was a luxury, you had to make every single bite count. Fatback. Fatback wasn't a delicacy, it was a necessity. Enslaved people weren't given choice cuts of meat, they were left with the scraps, the parts plantation owners didn't want. Fatback, the thick layer of fat from a pig's back, was one of the cheapest and most commonly distributed cuts. On its own, fatback wasn't exactly appetizing. It had almost no meat, just pure fat and skin. But in a world where enslaved people had to survive on meager rations, fatback was a valuable source of calories and energy. People found creative ways to cook it. Some salted it heavily to preserve it for longer, while others fried it in a pan until it turned crispy, using it to flavor cornbread, beans, or greens. The rendered fat could be used for cooking other ingredients, stretching meals, and even as a substitute for butter or oil, which were rare luxuries. Even though it was a low-quality cut, fatback had one major advantage. It was filling. A small portion could keep someone full for hours, helping enslaved people sustain their strength during long workdays. Over time, fatback became deeply embedded in Southern cooking. Even after slavery ended, many African American families continued using it in traditional dishes, not just for survival, but because it added richness and depth of flavor to foods like collard greens, black-eyed peas, and stews. But if you thought fatback was a tough ingredient to work with, wait until you hear about chitterlings, because when times were rough, even pig intestines weren't off the table, say. Chitterlings, chitlins. Let's be real, chitterlings or chitlins are not for the faint of heart. These were pig intestines, cleaned, boiled, and turned into a dish out of necessity, not choice. And yeah, the smell, absolutely intense. But when survival is the priority, you use everything. Slaves were often given the least desirable parts of an animal, and intestines were about as unwanted as it got. But with skill and patience, chitlins could be transformed into a filling, protein-packed meal. The process was long and tedious. The intestines had to be soaked, scrubbed, cleaned, and then boiled for hours to break down tough connective tissues. Once cooked, they were tender and chewy, usually served with vinegar, hot sauce, or whatever seasoning was available. They were often paired with cornbread, which helped soak up the juices and balance out the strong, earthy flavor. Sure, chitlins weren't a luxury, but they were a testament to survival. Enslaved people had to take what they were given and make it work. And believe it or not, chitlins are still a Southern delicacy today, often eaten on special occasions like New Year's for good luck. If chitlins weren't proof enough that nothing went to waste, let's talk about collard greens, because these leafy greens weren't just food, they were medicine too. Collard greens. You can't talk about soul food without mentioning collard greens. These tough leafy greens were a major staple for enslaved people, not just because they were filling and easy to grow, but because they were packed with nutrients in a diet that was often severely lacking in vitamins. Collards were one of the few crops that enslaved people could sometimes grow themselves in small garden plots. They were hardy, resilient, and grew in poor soil, making them one of the most accessible vegetables around. When cooked, they became tender and flavorful, usually simmered for hours with whatever seasoning or fat was available, oftentimes a small piece of fatback or salt pork. But here's the real kicker, the pot liquor. That's the nutrient-rich broth left behind after cooking the greens. And let me tell you, that liquid was gold. Enslaved people would soak it up with cornbread, or even drink it straight, because they knew wasting it wasn't an option. This was one of the few ways they could replenish nutrients after long, grueling days in the fields. Collards weren't just about survival, though. They became a symbol of resilience, strength, and even luck. That's why today, you'll still find them on Southern tables, especially on New Year's Day, because legend has it they bring prosperity. And speaking of greens, mustard greens were another nutrient-packed staple, but with a spicy little kick. Mustard greens. If collard greens were the steady, dependable choice, then mustard greens were their bold, peppery cousin. These leafy greens brought a little heat to the plate, and while they were just as nutritious, they had a sharper, spicier bite that made them stand out. Like collards, mustard greens were one of the few vegetables enslaved people could sometimes grow themselves. They thrived in poor soil and could be harvested multiple times, making them a reliable source of food. The cooking method? Slow and steady. They were often simmered down with fatback, salt pork, or whatever seasoning was available, turning them into tender, flavorful greens that packed a nutritional punch. And of course, pot liquor was a big deal here too. The rich, vitamin-packed broth left after cooking was so valuable that people made sure to soak it up with cornbread or even drink it straight. Mustard greens weren't just a survival food. They became part of a culinary tradition that still lives on today. They're a staple in southern kitchens, often found alongside cornbread, beans, and rice. Now, if mustard greens were bold and peppery, then turnip greens were the underdog, often overlooked, but just as important for survival. Turnip greens. Turnip greens were the definition of making the most out of nothing. See, turnips were grown mainly for their roots, but enslaved people weren't given the best parts of crops. Instead, they got the tops, the leafy greens that plantation owners saw as scraps. But as history shows time and time again, scraps can become something great. These greens were packed with vitamins, and just like collards and mustard greens, they were boiled down low and slow with fatback or salt pork to add flavor and richness. The result? A nutrient-dense, comforting dish that made sure nothing went to waste. Turnip greens had a milder, slightly bitter taste compared to mustard greens, making them a versatile choice for soups, stews, or just eaten on their own with cornbread to soak up the juices. And of course, that pot liquor? Still gold. These greens became a symbol of resourcefulness. What started as throwaway scraps turned into a staple dish that would survive generations. Even today, you'll still find them on southern menus, usually slow cooked to perfection. But greens weren't the only survival food. Black-eyed peas were another powerhouse ingredient, bringing both protein and good fortune to the table. Black-eyed peas. If you've ever had black-eyed peas on New Year's, you already know they're supposed to bring good luck. But for enslaved people, these little legumes were less about luck and more about survival. Black-eyed peas were cheap, filling, and packed with protein and fiber, making them a valuable food source on plantations. They didn't need rich soil or special care to grow, so they became a staple crop that was both accessible and nutritious. Cooking black-eyed peas was simple but effective. They were boiled for hours, sometimes with a little salt pork or fatback if it was available. The result? A hearty, rich dish that kept people full and fueled for the long, grueling workdays. They were often served with rice or cornbread, turning them into a complete meal that provided long-lasting energy. But black-eyed peas weren't just practical. They carried meaning. After emancipation, they became a symbol of prosperity and resilience. Eating them on New Year's Day became a Southern tradition, representing hope and abundance for the year ahead. And black-eyed peas weren't alone. Field peas were another underrated but essential part of the diet, proving that no small food was ever insignificant. Field peas. If black-eyed peas were the New Year's celebrity, then field peas were the everyday workhorse. These little legumes weren't as famous, but they were just as important for survival on plantations. Field peas were a crucial food source for enslaved people, providing a much-needed source of protein, fiber, and sustenance in an otherwise limited diet. Unlike the fresh green peas commonly eaten today, field peas, also southern peas, were hardy, drought-resistant, and easy to grow, making them an ideal crop for plantation fields. Enslaved people often grew field peas in small garden plots, using them to supplement the meager rations they were given. These peas were incredibly versatile and could be eaten in different ways depending on what was available. If they were picked young, they could be boiled as fresh peas. More often, they were left to dry on the vine, then stored and later cooked in soups, stews, or simple broths. Cooking field peas was a long process. They had to be soaked and boiled for hours to become soft enough to eat. If there was salt, pork, or fatback, it was added to enhance the flavor. Some enslaved cooks would also mix in wild herbs, onions, or whatever scraps of vegetables they could find, turning a pot of simple peas into a more nourishing meal. Like many other survival foods, field peas became an enduring part of Southern cuisine. After emancipation, formerly enslaved people continued to grow and cook field peas, and they became a staple in dishes like Hoppin' John. These peas weren't just food, they were a lesson in resilience. No matter the conditions, they grew strong, provided nourishment, and kept people going through the toughest times. And just like field peas, cowpeas were another hearty, reliable source of nutrition that kept people fed against all odds. Cowpeas. Cowpeas were survival in a pod. These small, hearty beans were a nutritional lifesaver, providing much-needed protein, fiber, and energy to people who had little else to eat. Like field peas, cowpeas were easy to grow and required minimal upkeep, making them an accessible food source on plantations. They thrived in hot, dry climates and could grow in poor soil, meaning they were one of the few reliable crops that enslaved people had access to. The cooking method? Slow and steady. Cowpeas were boiled until tender, usually with a bit of salt or pork fat if available. They were often paired with rice or cornbread, turning them into a filling, nourishing meal that provided long-lasting energy for people working in the fields. What made cowpeas special was their versatility. They could be used in soups, stews, or even mashed into thicker dishes when paired with vegetables and grains. But most importantly, they represented resourcefulness. Enslaved people took what little they had and turned it into something sustaining, no matter the odds. And speaking of making the most out of what was available, let's talk about Hoppin' John, a dish that mixed cowpeas, rice, and history into a single pot. Hoppin' John. Hoppin' John wasn't just a meal, it was a legacy. This simple yet filling dish combined cowpeas or black-eyed peas, rice, and whatever seasoning was available, creating a one-pot wonder that was both practical and packed with meaning. For enslaved people, Hoppin' John was a way to stretch limited ingredients into something hearty and nourishing. Rice and peas were cheap, filling, and easy to cook in large batches, making this dish perfect for feeding families with minimal resources. The dish was cooked low and slow, allowing the flavors to blend together, and if a bit of salt pork or bacon was available, it added a smoky, savory richness. The meal was basic, but effective, providing a balance of protein and carbohydrates to sustain long hours of labor. But Hoppin' John didn't just survive slavery, it evolved into a symbol of good fortune in the Black community. Even today, eating it on New Year's Day is believed to bring prosperity and luck, a tradition passed down through generations. From survival food to cultural icon, Hoppin' John represents endurance, creativity, and the ability to make something meaningful out of the simplest ingredients. And while rice and peas made a hearty meal, sometimes something sweet was needed, like boiled yams, a naturally sugary root that brought comfort in hard times. Boiled yams. When it came to naturally sweet, filling foods, yams were the MVP. Long before processed sugar was a thing, these starchy roots provided a natural source of energy for enslaved people who needed sustenance for long hours of work. Boiled yams were as simple as it got. Just peel, chop, and simmer them in hot water until they were soft and tender. No butter, no sugar, no fancy spices, just pure natural sweetness. And because yams were so dense, they helped fill stomachs when there wasn't much else to eat. But these weren't just filler food. They were also packed with vitamins and nutrients. They provided fiber, potassium, and complex carbs that kept people going for hours. Sometimes, if a little molasses or sorghum syrup was available, yams would be mashed together for a little extra flavor and energy. And while yams were a staple survival food, their close cousin, sweet potatoes, were just as important. Roasted over an open flame, they became an even easier, smokier way to enjoy this nutrient-packed root. Roasted sweet potatoes. If boiling yams was the basic go-to, then roasting sweet potatoes was the upgrade. This method required no pots, no water, and barely any effort. Just bury the potatoes in hot ashes, let them cook, and then peel back the skin to reveal soft, caramelized goodness. Sweet potatoes were loaded with natural sugars, so roasting them brought out an even deeper sweetness, making them one of the few treats available to enslaved people. Unlike boiled yams, which had a milder, softer texture, roasted sweet potatoes had a smoky, caramelized flavor that made them feel like a luxury. But beyond taste, these potatoes were a survival tool. They didn't spoil as quickly as other vegetables. They could be eaten hot or cold, making them a practical food to carry into the fields. Some people even saved them for later, eating them as a snack when hunger hit. Sweet potatoes were more than just food. They were comfort. They were one of the few ingredients that could be eaten on their own and still feel satisfying. And if you thought sweet potatoes were simple, wait until you hear about corn porridge, a dish that turned a handful of cornmeal into something warm, filling, and surprisingly rich. Corn porridge. Cornmeal was everywhere on plantations, and one of the easiest ways to turn it into a meal was by making corn porridge. This dish was warm, creamy, and one of the few comforting meals that could be made with minimal ingredients. Corn porridge was essentially cornmeal, water, and maybe a little salt or molasses if it was available. The mixture was boiled until thick, creating a dish that was somewhere between grits and oatmeal. It was simple but effective. A bowl of this in the morning could keep someone full for hours. But what made corn porridge really valuable was that it was versatile. If it was eaten plain, it was a quick and easy meal. But if someone had access to sorghum syrup, honey, or even a little fatback grease, it could be enhanced into something richer and more flavorful. It was also a meal for all ages. Children, elders, and field workers alike could eat it because it was easy to digest and required no chewing. Some even let it cool and harden, cutting it into slices to eat later. Corn porridge was more than just food, it was survival. And speaking of corn-based meals, hominy grits were another essential dish that turned ground corn into nourishment. Hominy grits. For enslaved people, hominy grits were more than just a meal. They were a lifeline. Corn was one of the few staple ingredients regularly provided on plantations, and enslaved people had to make it stretch as far as possible. Turning corn into grits was a way to make something filling, warm, and easy to prepare, even with limited cooking tools. Hominy grits started with dried corn kernels that were soaked in an alkaline solution, usually made from wood ash or lye. This process, known as nixtamalization, softened the kernels, removed the hulls, and made them easier to grind. Once the softened corn was rinsed and dried, it was crushed into coarse grains, creating what we now call grits. Cooking grits was simple but time-consuming. They were boiled in water for a long time, thickening into a hearty porridge that could be eaten on its own or used as a base for other ingredients. If available, people might stir in a bit of salt, lard, or leftover bacon grease to add flavor. On rare occasions, if sugar or molasses was accessible, grits could be sweetened for a small treat. But what made grits so important was that they were long-lasting. Dried hominy could be stored for months, making it a reliable food source when other ingredients were scarce. Plus, grits were slow digesting, meaning they kept people full longer, which was critical for those working long, brutal hours in the fields. Even today, grits remain a Southern classic, often eaten with butter, cheese, or even shrimp. But back then, they were pure survival food, a dish that reminded enslaved people that even simple things could provide strength. And while grits were a go-to for energy, when it came to something sweet, molasses was the closest thing to a sugary treat. Molasses. Molasses was plantation gold. It wasn't just a sweetener. It was a rare luxury, something that could turn plain food into something special. But the irony? It was a byproduct of the sugar industry, which enslaved people were forced to work in. Made during sugarcane processing, molasses was the thick, dark syrup left after sugar was extracted. Enslaved people were rarely given refined sugar, but they sometimes had access to molasses, which they used to flavor cornbread, porridge, and even yams. A drizzle of molasses could transform a bland meal into something a little more bearable. But molasses wasn't just a sweetener. It was also a source of energy. Packed with iron and minerals, it helped replenish nutrients in diets that were often nutritionally lacking. Some even mixed it with water to create an early version of an energy drink. Despite its bittersweet history, molasses became a key ingredient in Southern cooking, showing up in biscuits, baked beans, and even barbecue sauce. And speaking of sweet syrups, sorghum syrup was another natural sweetener that enslaved people relied on when molasses wasn't available. Sorghum syrup. If molasses was hard to come by, sorghum syrup was the next best thing. This thick, amber-colored syrup came from the sorghum plant, which was grown on plantations because it was drought-resistant and easy to harvest. Making sorghum syrup was a long process. The stalks were crushed to release their juices, which were then boiled down into a thick, sticky syrup. It wasn't as strong or bitter as molasses, but it had a rich, earthy sweetness that made it perfect for flavoring bland foods. Enslaved people used sorghum syrup wherever they could. It was drizzled over cornbread, mixed into grits, and even used to sweeten tea or water. Some even made simple desserts by mixing it with roasted nuts or flour to create quick, makeshift treats. But beyond taste, sorghum syrup was nutritious. It contained iron, potassium, and antioxidants, making it one of the few nutrient-rich ingredients available. In tough times, even a spoonful of sorghum syrup could provide a little energy boost. And while sorghum and molasses made life a little sweeter, when it came to survival protein, salt pork was one of the most crucial foods in the diet. Salt pork. If there was one go-to protein source for enslaved people, it was salt pork. It wasn't the good cuts of meat, it was the fatty, tough, salty leftovers that plantation owners didn't want. But in a world where every calorie counted, salt pork was a lifesaver. Salt pork was exactly what it sounds like, pork preserved in salt. This meant it could last for months without spoiling, making it a reliable food source when fresh meat was unavailable. Since enslaved people rarely had access to refrigeration, this was one of the few ways they could get some protein in their diet. The cooking process? Soak, boil, repeat. Because salt pork was ridiculously salty, it had to be soaked in water to remove some of the brininess before cooking. After that, it could be fried, stewed, or used to season vegetables, beans, or cornbread. It didn't take much. Even a small piece could flavor an entire meal. Salt pork wasn't about luxury, it was about making do. It was tough, greasy, and salty, but it helped keep people alive. And if salt pork was the flavor booster, stewed okra was the nutrient-packed side dish that helped stretch meals further. Stewed okra. Okra was one of the most important vegetables in enslaved people's diets. Why? Because it was nutritious, easy to grow, and could thrive in poor soil. If there was a vegetable that kept people going, okra was at the top of the list. Stewed okra was simple but packed with vitamins. The pods were chopped up and slow cooked with whatever was available: fatback, onions, peppers, or just water and salt. As it simmered, okra released its signature slimy texture, which actually helped thicken stews and stretch meals further. This wasn't just about taste. Okra provided much-needed nutrients, including vitamin C, fiber, and antioxidants. It helped with digestion, gave people energy, and was one of the few plant-based sources of protein available. Okra's African roots also made it culturally significant. Enslaved people brought farming knowledge from West Africa, where okra had been a staple for centuries. So cooking okra on plantations wasn't just about survival, it was a connection to home. And if stewed okra was nutritious and filling, fried okra was the crispy, golden alternative that made even the simplest meals feel special. Fried okra. Fried okra was the closest thing to comfort food that enslaved people had. While stewed okra was all about stretching meals, frying it turned it into a crunchy, flavorful snack that brought a little joy to the table. The process was simple but effective. Okra pods were sliced, coated in cornmeal, and then fried in hot fat. If there was salt pork grease, lard, or even a little butter, it was used to crisp up the edges and give the okra a golden, crunchy texture. This wasn't just about flavor. Fried okra was practical too. The crispy coating helped lock in moisture, making the okra last longer and giving it a heartier feel. It was often eaten on its own or used as a side dish alongside cornbread, beans, or whatever else was available. Fried okra was more than just food. It was a moment of relief. It was one of the few chances to enjoy something crispy, flavorful, and deeply satisfying in an otherwise harsh and exhausting life. And while okra was an essential vegetable, when it came to protein, catfish was one of the most common meats available, pulled straight from rivers and creeks. Catfish. When it came to getting fresh protein, catfish was a lifeline. Unlike plantation meat rations, which were scarce and unpredictable, catfish could be caught in nearby rivers and creeks, giving enslaved people a more reliable food source. Catching catfish was low cost and efficient. Using homemade fishing lines, baskets, or even their bare hands, enslaved people would pull these bottom-feeding fish from the water, ensuring their families had something to eat when other food was hard to come by. Once caught, catfish was cleaned, gutted, and either fried, stewed, or smoked to preserve it for later meals. If cornmeal or fat was available, it was coated and fried into something crispy and flavorful. If not, it could be boiled in a simple stew with whatever vegetables and spices were on hand. Catfish wasn't just about staying full, it was about self-sufficiency. It was one of the few sources of protein that enslaved people could catch for themselves, giving them a small piece of control in an otherwise restricted life. And while catfish thrived in southern waters, crappie fish was another widely available catch, offering a similar source of nutrition and just as many ways to cook it. Crappie fish. If catfish was the go-to fish for survival, crappie was its smaller, but just as useful cousin. These freshwater fish were abundant in southern lakes and rivers, making them one of the easiest fish to catch. Crappie fish were smaller and more delicate than catfish, but they still provided valuable protein for enslaved people who had limited access to meat. Fishing for crappie was often done using simple nets, makeshift fishing poles, or even woven traps placed in shallow waters. Cooking crappie was all about simplicity. If fat or grease was available, they were lightly fried, creating a crispy, flaky texture. If not, they were boiled in a broth with wild herbs, greens, or whatever seasoning could be found. In some cases, They were even dried and salted to make them last longer. Fish like crappie weren't just survival food. They were an example of how enslaved people used their skills and knowledge of the land to create some level of independence. But while fish provided valuable protein, sometimes the only available meat came from the forests, squirrel stew being a prime example of turning foraged game into a meal. Squirrel stew. Foraging for small game was another way enslaved people supplemented their diet, and squirrel stew was one of the most common ways to make a full meal out of very little. Squirrels were everywhere in the South, making them an easy target for hunting. Traps, slingshots, or even simple snares were used to catch them quickly, providing a rare chance to eat fresh meat when plantation rations were low. Once cleaned and skinned, the squirrel meat was boiled down into a stew, often with wild greens, onions, peppers, or roots that had been foraged nearby. The slow cooking process helped tenderize the meat, making it more palatable, and ensuring that every bit of nourishment was extracted. Squirrel stew was basic, but effective. It was high in protein, filling, and could feed multiple people when stretched with cornmeal dumplings or bread. It was a perfect example of making the most out of what nature provided. And if squirrels were hard to find, rabbits were another wild source of protein that could be hunted and turned into stew, ensuring nothing went to waste. Rabbit stew. If squirrel wasn't available, rabbit was the next best option for a wild-caught protein source. Rabbits were fast, small, and could be found all over the southern countryside, making them a valuable food source for enslaved people who had to supplement their limited diets. Catching a rabbit wasn't easy, but people used traps, snares, and sometimes dogs to hunt them down. Once caught, the rabbit was skinned, cleaned, and turned into a hearty stew that could be stretched to feed an entire family. The cooking process was simple. Slow simmering made the lean, tough meat tender, while whatever herbs, vegetables, or roots were available helped add flavor and nutrients. If there was salt pork or fatback, it was tossed in to give the broth more richness. And if nothing else was on hand, the rabbit was boiled with just salt and water, proving that even the simplest ingredients could create a filling meal. Rabbit stew was more than just food. It was a survival strategy. It was another way enslaved people used their knowledge of the land to secure more than what was rationed to them. And speaking of wild meat, opossum was another unexpected but essential source of protein, cooked in a way that made even the toughest meat edible. Opossum meat? Opossum meat was not for the faint of heart, but when food was scarce, nothing went to waste. These slow-moving nocturnal creatures were easy to trap, making them a reliable source of protein for enslaved people who had limited access to fresh meat. Preparing opossum took skill and patience. The meat was greasy, gamey, and had a strong, musky flavor. It required careful cleaning to make it more palatable. Often the animal was soaked in salt water or buttermilk overnight to reduce its wild taste. Cooking methods varied, but the most common way was roasting or stewing. If there were onions, peppers, or wild herbs available, they were used to mask the strong flavor and create a more enjoyable dish. In some cases, opossum was slow cooked with sweet potatoes, which helped balance the richness of the meat and make it more flavorful. Opossum meat wasn't a first choice by any means, but it was another example of resilience. Enslaved people made the most of what they had, ensuring that no opportunity for nourishment was wasted. And while opossums were common game, larger wild animals like deer and raccoon provided even more meat, making them highly valuable when they could be caught. Wild game, deer, raccoon. Foraging for small animals was one thing, but when someone managed to bring down a deer or raccoon, it was a major win. These animals provided a large supply of meat, which could be shared among multiple people or preserved for later use. Hunting deer was difficult and dangerous for enslaved people, especially since weapons were strictly controlled. But those who had trapping skills or access to bows and spears could sometimes catch one in the woods. When they did, it was an opportunity for much-needed protein. Raccoons, on the other hand, were easier to catch and could be trapped using baited snares near rivers or wooded areas. Like opossums, raccoon meat was gamey and tough, requiring slow cooking to break it down. Both deer and raccoon were often stewed or roasted with whatever seasonings were available. If there was salt or fat, it was used to enhance the flavor. If not, the meat was simply boiled down until tender and eaten with cornbread or greens to make it last longer. These animals represented more than just a meal. They symbolized resourcefulness, skill, and the ability to thrive despite extreme hardship. And while wild game provided occasional meat, when times were desperate, even corn husks could be turned into soup, proving that nothing was ever truly wasted. Corn husk soup. Corn was one of the most widely available foods on plantations, But enslaved people didn't just eat the kernels, they used every part of the plant, including the husks. Corn husk soup was a testament to survival, proving that even what others saw as waste could be turned into a meal. Since enslaved people were often given the lowest quality food, they had to be creative with what they had. Corn husks, which were normally thrown away, were sometimes boiled into a thin broth that could be used as a base for soups and stews. It didn't have much flavor on its own, but when combined with salt, herbs, or even small scraps of meat, it could turn into a nutrient-rich liquid that helped stretch meals further. In some cases, the husks were boiled with bones, onions, or wild greens, making the broth more flavorful and nutritious. It wasn't a hearty meal on its own, but in times of extreme scarcity, even a warm bowl of husk-infused broth could provide some relief from hunger. Enslaved people had no choice but to use everything, waste nothing, and find nourishment in even the most unexpected places. And when it came to high-energy survival snacks, roasted ground nuts, peanuts, were one of the most accessible and reliable foods available. Roasted ground nuts, peanuts. Peanuts may seem like a simple snack today, but for enslaved people, they were a valuable source of nutrition that could be eaten raw, roasted, or ground into a paste. In a world where food was scarce and energy was precious, peanuts were a lifesaver. Unlike some crops that required special care, peanuts could grow in poor soil, making them a common plantation crop. Enslaved people could sometimes gather leftover peanuts after harvest or grow small amounts for themselves. They were packed with protein, fat, and essential nutrients, providing long-lasting energy for the back-breaking work in the fields. The simplest way to eat them was roasting over an open fire. This brought out a deeper, nuttier flavor and made them easier to chew. If peanuts were plentiful, they could also be boiled for a softer texture or ground into a paste. An early version of peanut butter could be spread on cornbread or mixed into stews. Peanuts weren't just food, they were fuel. A handful could help sustain people through long hours of labor, and because they were portable, they could be eaten on the go. But while peanuts were a familiar crop, rice and beans were another survival staple that provided a strong foundation for plantation meals. Rice and beans. Rice and beans were one of the most essential meals for enslaved people. They were cheap, filling, and packed with nutrients, making them a go-to dish when food needed to stretch as far as possible. Rice was often grown on plantations, especially in southern coastal regions, while beans were easy to store and cook. Together, they created a complete protein, providing the sustenance needed for long, grueling days of work. Cooking rice and beans was a slow, steady process. The beans were usually boiled for hours until they became soft and creamy, while the rice was cooked separately and then mixed together. If there was salt pork, fat, or seasonings, they were added to enhance the flavor. If not, it was eaten plain, proving that even the simplest meals could keep people going. Rice and beans weren't just about filling empty stomachs, they were a link to African culinary traditions. Many enslaved people came from cultures where grains and legumes were dietary staples, so this dish became a way to preserve heritage, even in the harshest conditions. And while rice and beans provided sustenance, stewed greens with pork were another comforting dish that added much-needed nutrients to plantation diets. Stewed greens with pork. When food was scarce, stewed greens were a nutritional lifesaver. They were easy to grow, packed with vitamins, and could be stretched to feed multiple people with just a small pot. But what really elevated them was the addition of pork, if it was available. Most of the time, enslaved people were given the worst cuts of meat, like fatback, salted pork, or pork scraps. These weren't meaty or tender, but when boiled for hours with greens, they infused the broth with rich, smoky flavor. The result? A nutrient-dense, hearty dish that could be eaten alone, or paired with cornbread for a more filling meal. The greens varied depending on what was available: collards, mustard greens, turnip greens, or even wild plants like pokeweed. Since fresh vegetables were often hard to come by, this dish provided essential vitamins and minerals, helping people stay strong despite poor diets. The broth left behind, known as pot liquor, was just as valuable. Packed with flavor and nutrients, it was often soaked up with bread or even drunk straight. And while stewed greens with pork was a meal born out of necessity, it became a southern tradition that still exists today. Speaking of wild greens, pokeweed salad was another survival dish, but one that required serious skill to prepare. Pokeweed salad. Pokeweed might look like just another leafy green, but don't be fooled. This plant is highly toxic if not prepared the right way. But when food options were limited, enslaved people learned how to turn this dangerous weed into a safe, edible meal. The key to eating pokeweed was boiling it multiple times. The leaves and stems were harvested when young, then boiled in several changes of water to remove toxins. After that, they were cooked like other greens, sometimes with a bit of pork or fat if available. Pokeweed salad was a desperation dish, not because it tasted bad, but because eating it meant there weren't many other options. People took the risk of carefully preparing it because they needed all the nutrients they could get. Despite its dangers, pokeweed was full of vitamins, making it a valuable survival food. Over time, it even became a southern delicacy, with some people still preparing it today, though modern cooks use caution. But if pokeweed wasn't an option, other wild greens like dandelion greens were another foraged food source that provided nutrients and variety to plantation diets. Dandelion greens. Dandelion greens were the ultimate free food. They grew everywhere, required no maintenance, and were completely edible from root to flower. For enslaved people, these wild greens were an easy way to add nutrition to their meals when rations were especially scarce. Unlike pokeweed, dandelions weren't toxic, but they did have a bitter taste. That meant they were usually boiled or stewed to soften them up and reduce the bitterness. If there was salt, fat, or even a splash of vinegar, it was added to improve the flavor. Taste aside, dandelion greens were incredibly nutritious. They contained iron, calcium, fiber, and vitamins A and C, making them a powerful source of nourishment in diets that were often lacking in fresh vegetables. These greens weren't just thrown into stews and soups. Their roots were sometimes dried and ground to make a coffee substitute. Every part of the plant had a purpose, and nothing went to waste. Foraging for wild greens like dandelions was one of the many ways enslaved people used their knowledge of nature to stay as healthy as possible. And while dandelion greens were easy to find, foraging for wild mushrooms was another way to add variety to meals, if you knew which ones were safe. Wild mushrooms. Foraging for wild mushrooms was a risky but necessary skill. Enslaved people who knew which mushrooms were safe to eat could add much-needed variety and nutrition to their diets. But picking the wrong kind, that could be deadly. Mushrooms weren't widely cultivated at the time, so the only way to get them was searching the forests and fields. Certain types, like chanterelles, morels, and oyster mushrooms, were safe and nutritious, packed with protein, fiber, and vitamins. Others, though, were highly toxic. That meant enslaved people had to rely on generational knowledge or advice from indigenous groups who had long been foraging for food. Once gathered, mushrooms were stewed, roasted, or added to soups, bringing earthy umami flavors to otherwise bland meals. If there was fat or salt pork, mushrooms could be fried for extra richness. If not, they were simply boiled and eaten as is. Mushrooms were a resourceful food, but they required deep knowledge of the land. Those who could safely identify and cook them had an invaluable survival skill. And speaking of foraged foods, wild berries were another hidden treasure that provided natural sweetness and an extra boost of energy when other food was scarce. Foraged berries. Wild berries were one of the few naturally sweet foods that enslaved people could find. Unlike crops that belonged to plantation owners, berries grew freely in forests, fields, and along riverbanks, making them a rare treat that required no permission to harvest. Berries weren't just sweet. They were packed with nutrients. Blackberries, raspberries, and mulberries were full of vitamins, antioxidants, and natural sugars, providing a quick energy boost during long workdays. If they were gathered in large amounts, some were even dried and saved for later. Aside from eating them fresh, berries were sometimes mashed and mixed into cornmeal, creating an early version of a simple fruit bread or porridge. If sorghum or molasses was available, the natural tartness of the berries balanced perfectly with the syrup's sweetness. Foraging for berries was about more than just survival. It was one of the few moments where enslaved people could experience joy in nature, the ability to gather something for themselves outside the control of plantation owners. It was a small but powerful act of independence. And while berries were seasonal, another wild fruit, persimmons, could be found later in the year, offering a different kind of natural sweetness. Persimmons. Persimmons were nature's candy, but there was a catch. You had to know when to eat them. If you bit into an unripe persimmon, you'd get a mouthful of astringent bitterness that would pucker your lips instantly. But if you waited until they were soft and fully ripe, they became smooth, sweet, and perfectly edible. These small orange fruits grew wild across the South, meaning enslaved people could forage for them when food was scarce. Since persimmons ripened in late fall and winter, they provided a rare source of fruit when other fresh foods were no longer available. When ripe, Persimmons could be eaten fresh or mashed into a paste and mixed with cornmeal to make a simple bread. Some people dried them for later, turning them into a chewy, long-lasting snack that could be stored for weeks. Aside from being delicious, persimmons were rich in fiber, vitamins, and natural sugars, making them one of the best wild foods to find. And speaking of natural sweetness, cane syrup was another crucial ingredient that enslaved people used to flavor meals and make bitter foods more palatable. Cane syrup. Cane syrup was a sweetener born from hard labor. Enslaved people who worked the brutal sugarcane fields spent long hours harvesting, crushing, and boiling down the stalks into molasses and cane syrup. While refined sugar was reserved for plantation owners, cane syrup was sometimes left over and used to sweeten meals in the enslaved community. This thick golden syrup was less processed than molasses and had a lighter, more caramel-like flavor. It became a crucial way to add taste to otherwise bland foods. A drizzle of cane syrup could transform cornbread, porridge, or yams, giving them a rich, deep sweetness. Aside from flavor, cane syrup was a valuable source of energy. The natural sugars provided a quick boost, helping people push through exhausting workdays. Some even mixed it with water or tea to create an early version of an energy drink. Despite its origins in forced labor, cane syrup remained an important ingredient in Southern cooking, showing up in pies, sauces, and even barbecue recipes. And while cane syrup was a liquid gold sweetener, bone broth soup was a nutrient-packed survival meal made from whatever scraps were available. Bone broth soup. When food was scarce, bone broth soup was a lifeline. Even when meat wasn't available, bones could be boiled for hours to create a rich, flavorful broth that helped stretch meals further. Plantation owners kept the best cuts of meat, leaving enslaved people with scraps, bones, and the parts that were normally thrown away. But instead of letting them go to waste, they were turned into nourishing soups that could feed multiple people. The process was simple. Bones were simmered for hours, sometimes with wild greens, onions, or herbs to add flavor. The slow cooking released nutrients like collagen, calcium, and minerals, making it a healing food that provided strength and nourishment. If any small bits of meat were left on the bones, they were picked off and added to the soup. Some people even thickened the broth with cornmeal to make it more filling. Bone broth wasn't just a survival food. It was an example of making the most of every resource. And if bones weren't available, giblet stew was another way to turn unwanted animal parts into a filling meal. Giblet stew. Giblet stew was the original nose-to-tail cooking. When enslaved people were given scraps from butchered animals, nothing went to waste, not even the giblets, which included hearts, livers, gizzards, and other leftover organs. These parts were tough and full of strong flavors, but enslaved cooks knew how to turn them into something hearty and nourishing. The giblets were boiled down into a stew, often with vegetables, wild greens, cornmeal, or whatever ingredients were on hand. Slow cooking helped soften the meat and infuse the broth with rich, savory flavor. The dish was simple but packed with nutrients, providing iron, protein, and essential vitamins that were often missing from plantation diets. Some people even added flour or dumplings to stretch the meal further. Despite its humble beginnings, giblet stew became a staple in Southern cuisine and is still a beloved dish today, often served around the holidays. And while giblet stew used animal scraps, liver and onions was another resourceful dish that made use of one of the most nutrient-dense organ meats. Liver and onions. Liver might not be the most popular meat today, but for enslaved people, it was a powerful source of nutrition that helped combat fatigue and malnutrition. Given the least desirable cuts of meat, they made the best of it, and liver, while tough and strong tasting, was too valuable to waste. Cooking liver required care and patience. If available, it was soaked in milk or water to help remove some of its bitterness. Then it was pan-fried with onions, salt, and maybe a little pork fat, if there was any. The onions weren't just for flavor. They helped cut through the iron-rich taste of the liver, making it easier to eat. What made liver so important was its nutritional value. It was one of the few foods that provided iron, B vitamins, and protein, all of which were desperately needed in diets that were often nutrient deficient. A small portion could boost energy and help with physical endurance, making it a crucial survival food. Liver and onions was a dish that showed how enslaved people transformed scraps into something valuable. And when fresh fish was available, smoked herring was another clever way to preserve protein and ensure food lasted longer. Smoked herring. Smoked herring was one of the most practical proteins enslaved people had access to. Unlike fresh fish, which spoiled quickly, smoked herring could last for weeks. making it a reliable source of food when other options were scarce. Herring was often salted and dried first, then slowly smoked over a fire to further preserve it. This method removed moisture from the fish, preventing spoilage and making it easier to transport and store. The result? A strongly flavored, salty fish that could be eaten as is or cooked into stews, porridges, or even mashed and mixed into cornmeal. If there was fat or vegetables available, herring was sometimes fried to give it a crispy texture and balance out the saltiness. Because smoked herring lasted so long, it was often rationed out carefully, used to flavor dishes over multiple days. Even a small piece could be added to grits, greens, or stews, making simple meals heartier and more satisfying. Smoked herring was essential for survival, but when it wasn't available, dried fish of any kind was another way. Enslaved people preserved food and kept protein in their diets. Dried fish. When refrigeration wasn't an option, drying fish was one of the best ways to make sure it lasted. For enslaved people, drying fish wasn't just about preserving food, it was about ensuring survival. The process was straightforward but required time and patience. Fresh fish was gutted, cleaned, salted, and then left to dry in the sun or smoked over a fire. This removed moisture, preventing bacteria from growing and allowing the fish to be stored for weeks or even months. Dried fish was incredibly versatile. It could be reconstituted in water to soften it up for soups and stews, or eaten as is for a salty, protein-packed snack. When available, it was sometimes pounded into flakes and mixed into cornmeal dishes, grits, or even used as seasoning for greens and beans. This technique wasn't just practical, it was a skill that had been passed down from African food traditions. Many enslaved people came from regions where sun-drying and smoking fish were common preservation methods, so this was a way of holding on to ancestral knowledge, even in a foreign land. And while dried fish was a long-lasting protein source, when fresh meat was an option, frog legs were another unexpected but essential dish. Frog legs. Frog legs might seem unusual today, but for enslaved people they were a valuable source of protein when meat was scarce. If you knew where to look, rivers, ponds, and swamps provided these unexpected survival foods that could make a filling meal. Catching frogs required skill and patience. Some people used nets or handmade traps, while others relied on bare hands to grab them at night when they were most active. Once caught, the legs were cleaned and skinned, revealing tender white meat that was surprisingly mild in flavor, almost like chicken. Cooking methods varied depending on what was available. If there was fat or lard, frog legs were pan-fried, creating a crispy golden crust. If not, they were boiled in stews, with whatever wild greens or root vegetables could be found. Even with minimal seasoning, the meat was lean, nutritious, and provided essential protein for those who needed energy to endure grueling workdays. Frog legs were a testament to resourcefulness. They weren't eaten because they were a delicacy. They were eaten because survival meant making use of every available food source. When it came to maximizing every bit of an animal, cracklins were another example of how nothing went to waste. Cracklins. Cracklins were the original snack food, but they weren't eaten for fun. They were a way to ensure nothing got wasted. When enslaved people were given scraps of pork, they didn't just use the fat for cooking. They fried the leftover skin and fat trimmings into crispy, salty cracklins. Making cracklins was simple but effective. The pork skin and fat were cut into small pieces, then fried in hot grease until they became golden and crunchy. The result? A rich, fatty snack that provided quick energy and could be stored for later. If there was salt or seasoning available, it was sprinkled on top to enhance the flavor. Cracklins weren't just a side dish. They were often added to cornbread batter to create a heartier, more filling meal. When food was scarce, even a handful of these crispy bites could provide much-needed calories to keep people going. Even after slavery, cracklins remained a staple in Southern cooking. Today, they're still enjoyed as a crunchy, flavorful treat, a reminder of how resourcefulness turns scraps into something lasting. And speaking of corn-based survival foods, cornmeal dumplings were another dish that helped stretch meals further with just a few basic ingredients. Cornmeal dumplings? Cornmeal dumplings were a simple yet essential food that helped bulk up meals when rations were limited. With no wheat flour available, enslaved people turned to cornmeal, one of the few ingredients they had in abundance, to make dense, filling dumplings that could stretch a pot of stew or soup. The recipe was basic, but effective. Cornmeal was mixed with water, salt, and sometimes a little fat if it was available. The dough was then shaped into small balls and dropped into boiling broth, where they absorbed flavor and thickened the stew. These dumplings weren't light and fluffy like modern versions. They were dense, hearty, and designed to keep people full for as long as possible. They soaked up the rich juices from stews, making sure that nothing went to waste. Cornmeal dumplings were a prime example of resilience. Even with limited resources, enslaved people found ways to make meals more substantial and satisfying. They weren't fancy, but they were a crucial part of survival. And when fall arrived, another starchy vegetable, boiled pumpkin, became a seasonal staple that added both nutrition and natural sweetness to the diet. Boiled pumpkin. When fall came around, pumpkins weren't just for decoration, they were survival food. Since enslaved people had limited access to fresh produce, they used what was available, and pumpkins were easy to grow, store, and turn into a filling meal. Boiled pumpkin was one of the simplest ways to prepare it. Pumpkin was peeled, cut into chunks, and simmered in water or broth until soft. If there were spices, molasses, or fat, they were added for extra flavor and richness. But even plain boiled pumpkin was nutritious and provided essential vitamins, fiber, and natural sugars that helped sustain people through long hours of labor. Sometimes boiled pumpkin was mashed into a porridge-like consistency or mixed with cornmeal to make it more filling. If dried out, it could even be stored for later use, ensuring that food lasted beyond harvest season. Pumpkin wasn't just food, it was survival. It was a rare ingredient that provided both nutrition and a hint of natural sweetness, making it a small comfort in difficult times. And while pumpkins were a seasonal staple, wild honey was a rare but treasured find that provided one of the few sources of natural sugar. Wild honey. Finding wild honey was like striking gold. Natural sweetness was hard to come by, so when enslaved people came across a beehive, it was a major win. Honey wasn't just a sweetener, it was medicine, energy, and a rare luxury all in one. Getting to the honey, though, was no easy task. Without modern beekeeping tools, people had to brave swarms of bees to collect the golden syrup. Some used smoke to calm the hive, while others relied on quick hands and determination. Once harvested, the honey was strained and stored carefully to make it last as long as possible. Honey was used sparingly. A little went a long way. It was drizzled over cornbread, stirred into porridge, or simply eaten by the spoonful for a quick boost of energy and nutrients. Some even used it to soothe sore throats or heal wounds, showing how food and medicine were often one and the same. And while honey was a precious find, another foraged food, acorn bread, was a creative way to turn tree nuts into a life-sustaining meal. Acorn bread? Acorn bread was a survival food born from necessity. Enslaved people had to find nourishment wherever possible, and acorns, though bitter in their raw form, could be transformed into a filling, nutrient-rich bread with the right preparation. The process started with gathering and shelling acorns. But here's the tricky part. Acorns contain tannins, which make them bitter and inedible unless properly leached. To remove the bitterness, they were soaked in water for days, sometimes boiled multiple times until the tannins were washed away. Once leached, the softened acorns were dried and ground into a coarse flour. This flour was then mixed with water, sometimes cornmeal or wild honey, and formed into small cakes or loaves. If cooked on a hot stone or buried in the ashes of a fire, it became a dense, earthy-tasting bread that could be eaten on its own or alongside stews and soups. Acorn bread wasn't just food, it was ingenuity. It turned what others overlooked into sustenance, proving that survival depended on resourcefulness and deep knowledge of nature. And speaking of foraged nuts, roasted chestnuts were another wild food that provided warmth and nourishment during colder months. Roasted chestnuts. Chestnuts were a rare but valuable find for enslaved people who foraged for food. These starchy, slightly sweet nuts weren't just a treat, they were survival food, offering much-needed calories and essential nutrients when rations ran low. Chestnut trees grew wild in forests, making them free for the taking if you knew where to look. The challenge? They had to be gathered before wildlife got to them first. Once collected, chestnuts were peeled and roasted over an open fire, turning them into a warm, filling snack that could be eaten on the spot or saved for later. Unlike many other wild nuts, chestnuts had a soft, starchy texture, rather than being hard and oily. This made them more versatile. They could be mashed into a paste, mixed into cornmeal, or even boiled to create a thick porridge. Beyond taste, roasted chestnuts provided sustained energy, making them an ideal food for long workdays. Since they were naturally slightly sweet, They also felt like a small luxury in a world where sweetness was hard to come by. And while chestnuts were a seasonal staple, watermelon was a refreshing and hydrating fruit that provided relief during the hot summer months. Watermelon. Watermelon was more than just a refreshing fruit. It was a lifesaver in the scorching heat of the southern plantations. Packed with water and natural sugars, it helped keep people hydrated while providing a quick source of energy during long, grueling workdays. Unlike some crops that required intensive labor, watermelons were relatively easy to grow. Enslaved people sometimes planted them in hidden garden plots, giving them access to fresh food outside of the rations controlled by plantation owners. If they weren't able to grow their own, they would forage for wild melons in fields and along riverbanks. Watermelons were usually eaten raw, sliced into chunks, and shared among families and workers as a moment of relief from the heat. The fruit's high water content made it one of the best ways to stay hydrated, especially for people working in the fields with little access to clean drinking water. Even the rinds weren't wasted. In some cases, they were boiled down into preserves or pickled, ensuring that every part of the fruit was put to use. Watermelon was more than just food. It was a symbol of survival, resilience, and nourishment, proving that even in the harshest conditions, nature could still provide relief. The foods enslaved people ate on plantations weren't just about filling an empty stomach. They were about surviving in a system designed to break them. With little control over what they were given, they had to use skill, creativity, and deep knowledge of the land to make nutritious, filling meals from almost nothing. These dishes carry stories, history, and the echoes of those who came before us. They remind us that even in unimaginable hardship, enslaved people found ways to preserve traditions, sustain themselves, and pass down knowledge through food. So next time you sit down to enjoy a plate of collard greens, cornbread, or black-eyed peas, remember, it's not just food, it's history on a plate. A story of endurance, survival, and the ability to turn scraps into something lasting. If you found this journey through history insightful, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into the history of food.